On the evening of August 4th, 2020, the skies over Beirut, Lebanon turned orange. At that moment, everything in the city felt like the opening scene of a war movie. A shockwave tore through the capital, flattening buildings, hurling cars into the air, and leaving the streets in stunned silence. At first, no one knew what had happened, but soon, all eyes turned to a warehouse at the city's main port, a structure already engulfed in flames, with thick smoke pouring from its roof. And this wasn't just any fire. This was the beginning of something far worse. See, inside that building were 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate. And to put that into perspective, just a few hundred pounds of it can level an entire city block. These weren't just forgotten bags of fertilizer sitting around by accident. They had been confiscated from a Russian cargo ship back in 2014, and for over 6 years, they were left in that warehouse. No security, no proper storage, just a massive stockpile of volatile chemicals in the heart of a densely populated city, waiting for something to go wrong. That night, something did. A fire, possibly ignited by nearby fireworks, triggered a chain reaction, and what followed was one of the most powerful non-nuclear explosions ever recorded. The initial blast sent a column of smoke rising into the air, but just seconds later, as bystanders continued filming, every screen went white. The second blast was cataclysmic, ripping through concrete like paper, vaporizing grain silos, and sending a mushroom cloud curling into the sky. The blast wave shattered glass over 10 kilometers away. Hospitals collapsed. Entire districts were flattened, and in an instant, more than 300,000 people were left homeless. The death toll that night stood at over 200, but rescue workers knew it would climb. Over 6,500 were injured, many by shards of glass, others by the buildings that simply ceased to exist. One nurse at St. George's Hospital, less than 2 kilometers from Ground Zero, delivered 3 babies by flashlight that night. The hospital itself was destroyed. Patients were treated in the street, on bloodied mattresses, surrounded by rubble. The explosion was so strong that people in Cyprus felt it, 200 kilometers away. This was like a nuclear bomb, one witness said, still covered in dust and blood. What have we done to deserve this? What makes this even harder to accept is how easily it could have been prevented. No guards, no safety systems, no oversight, just a massive stockpile of explosive material stored in a busy port. The Prime Minister promised justice, but what the people got was silence, and what's left behind is a 140-meter-wide crater still carved into the city's edge, a reminder that the worst disasters don't always come from above. Sometimes they're already here, just waiting for a spark. But Beirut wasn't the only place where fireworks turned deadly. Just 4 years earlier, in the heart of Mexico, another explosion ripped through a city, this time in broad daylight, right in the middle of a celebration. It happened in Tultepec, a small city known for its centuries-old tradition of fireworks making. In fact, over half the population made their living from it. It was part of their identity, their pride. And at the center of it all was the San Pablito Market, Latin America's largest fireworks bazaar. That afternoon, just after 3 p.m., a single explosion tore through the market. Within seconds, it triggered a devastating chain reaction. One stall after another went up in flames, hundreds of them, each packed with handcrafted explosives, gunpowder, and color bombs. The entire market lit up like a battlefield. Fireballs shot into the sky. Shockwaves rattled nearby homes. And from miles away, you could see the column of smoke stretching into the air. By the time emergency crews arrived, there was nothing left to save. The market had been incinerated. The stalls were reduced to twisted sheets of metal, charred wooden frames, and scorched pavement. And the bodies lay scattered among the debris. Some burned beyond recognition. 42 people were killed, many of them vendors who never had a chance to escape. More than 80 others were injured, including 6 children. One of them, a young girl with burns covering 90% of her body. Her clothing had melted into her skin. The blast was so violent that nearby homes crumbled. Windows shattered for blocks, and entire families were pulled from the rubble. For Tultepec, the city that lived and breathed fireworks, this wasn't just a tragedy. In the end, the authorities searched for answers. Some blamed poor storage, Others pointed to a spark from gunpowder in the air, but no single cause was ever confirmed. Only the aftermath remained, and with it, a silence where celebration once stood, because all it took was one mistake, and the fire did the rest. That same year, on the other side of the world, another explosion ripped through a celebration, but this one happened during a sacred ritual. In the early hours of April 10, 2016, while most of the town of Paravur was still asleep, the Puttingal Temple in southern India was alive with sound. Thousands had gathered for the final night of a week-long festival honoring the goddess Bhadrakali, one of the most revered deities in the region. For locals, it was a moment of joy, of devotion, of light. But just before 3:30 in the morning, that light turned deadly. Two rival groups had been staging a competitive fireworks display, a tradition deeply rooted in Kerala's temple festivals. The bigger the blast, the greater the blessing. And this time, they wanted to outdo each other. Then, something went wrong. A spark, possibly from a firework locally called a mitu, fell into a nearby concrete storage building where massive quantities of firecrackers were being held for the next celebration. The result wasn't just a fire, it was a detonation. The explosion was so powerful that it leveled nearby structures, including the temple's office and parts of the shrine itself. Concrete walls collapsed. Debris rained down on the crowds. The shockwave was felt over a kilometer away. 102 people were killed. Some were crushed under concrete. Others were trapped in the fire with no way to escape. Over 350 people were injured with broken bones, deep burns, and injuries so severe that some couldn't even be identified. The blast was so strong it damaged more than 150 homes around the temple. Walls collapsed, roofs caved in, and whole families were buried under the rubble. The rescue effort was massive. Helicopters were deployed. Naval medical teams flew in from Kochi. Victims were rushed to local hospitals in every vehicle available. Ambulances, buses, even private cars. One doctor described the scene as a war zone of bodies. And the tragedy didn't end with the fire. As investigators began to ask questions, it came to light that the temple had been denied official permission to hold the fireworks display. Authorities had warned of safety concerns, but under pressure from the community, the show went on. In the aftermath, India's High Court banned firecracker displays after sunset across the state's places of worship. But for the families who lost loved ones, it was far too late. Because this wasn't just a failure of safety, it was a moment where tradition collided with negligence and faith met fire. In a quiet neighborhood in Ontario, California, a backyard explosion turned an entire block into a war zone. It wasn't a factory, it wasn't a warehouse, it was a house, one storing a massive illegal stockpile of fireworks. March 16, 2021. Around 12:30 in the afternoon, strange popping sounds echoed down Francis Street, like firecrackers, but louder. People stepped outside trying to see what was going on. Then, without warning, the house at the center of it all exploded. Not in a single blast, but in a terrifying chain of detonations. It started with one firework going off in the backyard, likely triggered by heat or a small spark. But the real danger was what lay hidden. A massive illegal stockpile of fireworks crammed into the garage and shed. Once the fire reached those, everything ignited. Boom after boom rocked the neighborhood. The blast grew louder, faster, more violent. A rolling storm of fire and sound. Red and white flashes lit up the sky like a war zone, while pieces of the house were launched into the air. Burning debris rained down onto roofs, trees caught fire, and smoke poured into the streets. 2 people were killed instantly, 38-year-old Alex Paez and his 20-year-old cousin, Caesar. Both were believed to be in the yard, handling or standing near the fireworks when the fire broke out. The explosion was so violent it tore through the house in seconds, reducing it to rubble and leaving nothing but a scorched crater in its place. The shockwave rippled down the block, destroying cars, breaking windows, and setting other homes ablaze. What started as a quiet afternoon became one of the most violent blasts the city had ever seen, and what was left behind was barely recognizable, just a blackened pit where a home used to be. The fire spread fast, scorching cars, trees, and nearby buildings. All around, glass littered the streets, roofs had caved in, and the smell of smoke hung in the air for days. A quiet neighborhood had been turned into a disaster zone. Next door, neighbors ran for their lives. Some barely escaped as flames leapt across fences and tore through buildings. One house caught fire and had to be condemned. Dozens more were damaged. The entire block looked like it had been hit by an airstrike. Emergency crews rushed in, battling fires and pulling survivors from the wreckage. But the damage was already done. What started as a hidden stockpile ended in disaster, with lives lost, homes destroyed, and a neighborhood scarred forever. Because when explosives are hidden in plain sight, it only takes one spark to blow everything apart. It was supposed to be a routine detonation, controlled, contained, safe, but instead, it turned a quiet South Los Angeles street into a blast zone. On the evening of June 30th, 2021, LAPD officers were preparing to dispose of a large cache of illegal fireworks they had seized earlier that day. The location? A residential block on 27th Street, lined with homes, families, and parked cars. Inside a specialized containment vessel, built to neutralize explosives safely, officers loaded more than 40 pounds of fireworks. The problem? That was nearly double the amount the chamber could safely handle. At 7:37 p.m., the device failed. The vessel didn't contain the explosion. It became part of it. The blast hit like a hammer. A shockwave ripped through the street, shaking the ground and blowing out windows in every direction. The containment vessel, meant to hold the explosion, had split open like a grenade, sending chunks of metal flying like shrapnel. Homes buckled under the pressure. Cars were flipped, doors torn off their hinges, entire walls collapsed. Glass poured from shattered windows. Trees cracked and fell. Smoke filled the air. People screamed. Some ran. Others were too stunned to move. 17 people were hurt, some thrown to the ground, others cut by flying debris. More than 20 homes were left in ruins. Roofs were gone. Living rooms were open to the sky, and over 80 residents, many of them children and elderly, lost everything in seconds. That night, families stood barefoot in the street, holding each other, watching their homes burn or crumble. For them, it felt like a bomb had gone off, because it might as well have. One moment, police were securing the scene. The next, the entire block looked like it had been hit by an airstrike. And all of it came from a decision to detonate dangerous explosives in the middle of a neighborhood. Because when those meant to protect underestimate the danger, the damage can be just as deadly.